My family comes first, Phyllis. You're always last. My daughter-in-law said it so calmly, right in the middle of Sunday dinner, while I stood there holding the peach cobbler I'd spent 3 hours baking for everyone. The room went silent. My son Ethan lowered his eyes and said nothing. Then the pain hit my chest. Sharp, crushing. I reached for the edge of the table as my granddaughter Lily whispered, "Grandma." But what terrified me most wasn't the pain. It was the quick glance Vanessa gave the leather folder beside Ethan's chair, and the smile she tried to hide when I could barely breathe. If you've ever felt unwanted by the very people you sacrificed your life for, I want you to stay with me for this story. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read as many comments as I can, especially from those of you who understand what family heartbreak really feels like. And if stories about strength, betrayal, and healing speak to you, don't forget to like and subscribe. People like to say motherhood is the purest kind of love. I used to believe that with my whole heart. My name is Phyllis Woods. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, I measured my happiness by one thing: only whether my son was okay. Not me, not my marriage, not my dreams, just Ethan. I became a nurse when I was 23 years old. Back then, Daniel and I lived in a tiny apartment outside Columbus, Ohio, with leaky windows and pipes that groaned all winter long. We didn't have much, but we had hope. Daniel worked construction during the day and repaired roofs on weekends. I worked 12-hour hospital shifts that often became 16. When Ethan was born, I thought my heart might burst from loving someone that much. And from that moment on, every decision I made revolved around him. I missed vacations to pay for his school clothes. I picked up extra night shifts to help him attend baseball camp. I stayed awake beside his bed through fevers, nightmares, and heartbreaks. Daniel used to joke that if Ethan asked me for the moon, I'd start building a ladder. Maybe he was right. When Ethan was 14, Daniel's construction business nearly collapsed after a lawsuit from a client. We almost lost everything. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late one night, staring at overdue bills while Ethan slept upstairs. I quietly removed my wedding bracelet and sold it the next morning. Daniel cried when he found out, but I told him something I truly believe: jewelry doesn't matter. Family does. That became the motto of my life. Family first. Funny, isn't it? Years later, those same words would be used to destroy me. When Daniel got sick, everything changed again. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors were gentle but honest. We didn't have much time. I took leave from the hospital to care for him at home. I fed him, bathed him, held him when the pain became unbearable. Some nights I sat on the bathroom floor crying silently so he wouldn't hear me. Ethan visited when he could, but he was already building his own life then. He had a good sales job, a condo downtown, and a girlfriend he seemed completely enchanted by, Vanessa Mitchell. The first time I met her, she walked into my kitchen carrying a bottle of wine and wearing a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. But she smiled warmly and hugged me like we were already family. "Ethan talks about you constantly," she said sweetly. "I feel like I already know you." And honestly, I adored her. She was polished, educated, beautiful. The kind of woman who always smelled expensive and never seemed to wrinkle her clothes. After years of worrying Ethan would end up lonely or drifting through life, Vanessa looked like stability. Daniel wasn't so sure. One night after they left, he sat quietly in his recliner, staring at the dark television screen. "She's very charming," he said carefully. I smiled. "That's a strange way to say you like her." He looked over at me slowly. "I didn't say I liked her. I laughed at the time. I wish I hadn't." Daniel passed away 8 months later. The emptiness afterward nearly swallowed me whole. Have you ever lived with someone for over 40 years and suddenly found yourself reaching for them in the dark, only to remember they're gone? That grief changes you. The house became unbearably quiet. I'd still cook too much food without thinking. Sometimes I caught myself listening for Daniel's truck in the driveway before reality hit me all over again. Ethan started visiting more often after the funeral. At first, I thought it was because he was worried about me. Maybe part of him was, but Vanessa usually came too. And slowly, things began to shift. Subtle things at first, small enough to make me question myself. Sunday dinners became shorter. Phone calls became less frequent. Holidays somehow always ended up at Vanessa's parents' house instead of mine. Linda and Gary Mitchell lived in a wealthy suburb outside Cincinnati and loved reminding people of it. Linda decorated her home like a magazine spread and spoke with the kind of fake politeness that could cut glass. "Oh, Phyllis," she once said during Thanksgiving, glancing around my dining room, "your home feels so nostalgic." Nostalgic. That was the word rich people used when they wanted to call something outdated without sounding rude. Vanessa laughed softly beside her mother. Ethan didn't notice, or pretended not to. At Christmas, I spent nearly 2 weeks knitting a blanket for Vanessa by hand because she once mentioned loving handmade things. When she opened it, her smile froze for just a second before she recovered. "Oh," she said lightly. "How thoughtful." 2 days later, I saw the blanket folded in the back seat of her car beside grocery bags and cleaning supplies. Unused, forgotten. Still, I made excuses for her. "She's busy." She didn't mean it. "You're too sensitive, Phyllis." That became another habit of mine, shrinking my own pain until it barely seemed real. The truth is, older women are taught to disappear quietly, to avoid causing trouble, to be grateful for crumbs. And I was very, very good at that. About 2 years into their marriage, Ethan stopped dropping by unexpectedly. Everything had to be scheduled through Vanessa. "She likes structure," he explained once. Structure. Another harmless sounding word. One afternoon, I called Ethan because my kitchen sink had burst underneath the cabinet. Water flooded the floor and I panicked. "I'll come after work," he promised. But an hour later, Vanessa called instead. "Ethan's exhausted, Phyllis. Can't this wait until tomorrow?" I stood there ankle deep in water holding the phone. "I just thought, she interrupted with a little laugh. "Sometimes I think you still expect him to be your husband instead of your son." The words hit me harder than she probably realized. I apologized immediately. Apologized. For needing help. That night, while mopping water alone at nearly midnight, I remembered something Daniel once told me years earlier. Be careful not to love someone so much that you teach them your pain doesn't matter. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Now, I wonder if he saw this coming long before I did. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath all the excuses and denial, a terrible question had already begun forming. What if Vanessa didn't just dislike me? What if she wanted Ethan to slowly forget I mattered at all? The first time Ethan asked me for money after Daniel died, he sounded embarrassed. "Mom, I hate even bringing this up." That sentence alone was enough to make me reach for my purse. He told me the condo needed emergency plumbing repairs. Vanessa had recently reduced her hours at work because of stress, and they were trying to stay afloat. "It's only temporary," he promised. "I'll pay you back." I believed him immediately. Not because the story made sense, because he was my son. I transferred $3,000 the same afternoon. Vanessa called me later that evening, sounding emotional. "You have no idea how much this helps us, Phyllis," she said softly. "We're so lucky to have you." For the first time in months, I felt appreciated again, needed. That feeling can make a person blind. Over the next year, the requests kept coming: a broken furnace, medical bills, unexpected taxes, Lily's preschool tuition. Every explanation arrived wrapped in urgency and shame. And every single time, I told myself the same thing: family helps family. I dipped into savings Daniel and I had spent decades building. At first, I barely noticed the numbers shrinking. After all, what good was money if not to help your child? That's what I told myself while quietly postponing replacing my aging car. That's what I told myself while cutting coupons at the grocery store. That's what I told myself while wearing shoes with worn out soles because I didn't want to waste money on myself. Meanwhile, Ethan and Vanessa somehow always seemed to be upgrading their lives. New furniture appeared in their home. Vanessa started carrying designer handbags. Their kitchen suddenly had marble countertops. When I asked about it, Ethan laughed nervously. Vanessa got a great deal. There was always a great deal. Always an explanation. One Saturday afternoon, Vanessa invited me over for Lily's 6th birthday party. Their house was packed with people from her side of the family, loud laughter, expensive wine children running through the living room. I carried in 2 homemade cakes because Lily loved my baking. But before I could even set them down, Linda Mitchell wrinkled her nose slightly. "Oh, goodness," she said with a tight smile. Vanessa already ordered custom desserts from that French bakery downtown. The way she said French bakery made my cake sound like something pulled from a gas station shelf. "I just thought Lily might enjoy both," I said quietly. Vanessa kissed the air near my cheek without actually touching me. "That's sweet, Phyllis. We'll put yours in the kitchen. Not on the table, not near the guests. In the kitchen." I stood there holding the cake carrier while waiters arranged elegant little pastries under decorative lights. Waiters. For a 6-year-old's birthday party. I suddenly realized I probably paid for half of it. Later that afternoon, while looking for Lily upstairs, I passed the partially open office door and heard voices inside. Linda's voice came first. "She gives too much because she wants to feel important." Then Vanessa laughed softly. "I know. Ethan feels guilty saying no to her so honestly, it's easier to let her help." My stomach tightened. Not help us. Help her. As if I were some lonely old woman buying affection. I stepped away before they could see me. My face burned with humiliation, but by the time I got home, I had already started making excuses again. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe they didn't mean it cruelly. The lies we tell ourselves to survive can be astonishing. A few months later, Ethan called me late at night, sounding panicked. "Mom, I really messed up." Apparently, he and Vanessa had invested in a business opportunity through one of Gary Mitchell's friends. The investment collapsed, and now they owed money. How much, I asked carefully. There was a long silence. 20,000. I nearly dropped the phone. "That's Ethan, that's almost everything I have left in liquid savings." "I know," he whispered. "I know. But if we don't pay, this Vanessa's parents are going to lose their minds." Interesting, isn't it? Not we'll lose the house. Not Lily won't eat. The real fear was upsetting Vanessa's parents. Still, I agreed. Of course I did. The next morning, I went to the bank and transferred the money. The young teller looked concerned when she saw the withdrawal amount. "Are you sure about this, ma'am?" I smiled tightly. "Yes, it's for family." On the drive home, I cried harder than I had in years. Not because of the money, because deep down, I knew something was wrong. But admitting it felt unbearable. A week later, Ethan and Vanessa suddenly stopped mentioning financial stress altogether. In fact, Vanessa seemed happier than she had in months. Then came the photos. Pictures on social media from a luxury resort in Scottsdale, Arizona. Poolside cocktails, spa treatments, golf courses, matching white outfits. Linda and Gary Mitchell smiling beside them. I stared at those photos until my vision blurred. At first, I honestly thought maybe the trip had been canceled before and reposted later. But then I saw the date. 3 days after I gave Ethan $20,000. My hands trembled so badly I almost dropped my phone. I called Ethan immediately. He answered on the fourth ring. "Oh, hey, Mom." You're in Arizona silence. Then came the sound of a door closing as if he'd stepped away from people. "It was Vanessa's parents' idea," he said quickly. "They covered most of it. Most of it." Another silence. I felt suddenly cold all over. "Ethan, did my money pay for this trip?" "No," he said too fast. "Not directly. Not directly." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. For the first time in my life, I heard something in my son's voice that terrified me. Cowardice. Not cruelty. Cowardice. There's a difference. Cruel people hurt you without caring. Cowards hurt you because they're too weak to stop someone else. And somehow that realization hurt even more. After we hung up, I opened my banking app and began scrolling through months of transactions more carefully than I ever had before. Small things started standing out immediately. Restaurant charges I didn't recognize, streaming subscriptions connected to Ethan's email, a furniture payment plan. Then I found something that made my chest tighten. A charge for 5 plane tickets to Arizona, paid with my credit card. My card. The one I'd given Ethan years ago for emergencies only. I stared at the screen so long my eyes watered. The worst part wasn't the theft. It was knowing Ethan probably let it happen. That night, I barely slept. And around 2 in the morning, while sitting alone in the dark living room, another memory resurfaced. Vanessa standing in my kitchen months earlier, casually pouring herself coffee while saying, "At your age, managing finances can get overwhelming." At the time, I thought she sounded concerned. Now I realize something horrifying. She wasn't worried about me forgetting things. She was planting the idea that I already had. The Sunday dinner started before I even walked through the door. I could feel it. You know how sometimes tension hangs in the air, so thick it almost feels physical, like stepping into a room where everyone stopped talking 1 second too late. That was Ethan and Vanessa's dining room that evening. The smell of rosemary chicken drifted from the kitchen. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers. The dining table looked like something from a magazine, crystal glasses, folded linen napkins, candles floating in glass bowls. Beautiful. Cold. I stood there holding my homemade peach cobbler in both hands while Vanessa glanced at it briefly. "Oh," she said, "you brought dessert?" "Not thank you. Not Lily will love that. Just, oh." I forced a smile. "It's Ethan's favorite recipe. Daniel used to love it too." For a split second, Ethan looked uncomfortable at the mention of his father. Then Vanessa smoothly slid her arm through his. "Well," she said brightly, "we already ordered desserts from Bellini's bakery, but I'm sure we can find space somewhere." Somewhere. Like my food was an inconvenience. Lily came running into the hallway before I could respond. "Grandma." She wrapped her tiny arms around my waist so tightly, I nearly cried on the spot. That little girl was the only person in that house who loved me without conditions. "You came?" she said. "Of course I came, sweetheart." Vanessa's smile tightened slightly. Dinner guests slowly filled the room. Linda and Gary Mitchell, two couples from Vanessa's social circle, and Ethan's coworker Brian with his wife. I noticed immediately that I was the only one over 60 in the room. The only one who looked ordinary. Everyone else seemed polished in that effortless upper middle class way. Expensive watches, perfect hair, teeth so white they almost glowed under the chandelier. Meanwhile, I wore my nicest navy blue sweater and the pearl earrings Daniel bought me on our 25th anniversary. For the first time in years, I suddenly felt poor. Not financially, socially. The dinner began pleasantly enough. Vanessa dominated every conversation effortlessly. She talked about a charity luncheon she attended, a new yoga studio opening downtown, and a couple's trip she and Ethan were planning for Napa Valley. Interesting. I hadn't heard anything about a Napa trip before. Then again, I hadn't heard about a lot of things lately. At one point, Brian asked Ethan, "So how's your mom doing, living alone these days?" Before Ethan could answer, Vanessa laughed lightly. "Oh, Phyllis refuses to slow down. Honestly, she's stubborn." Something about the way she said stubborn bothered me, like she was speaking about a difficult patient instead of family. Linda took a sip of wine and added, "Aging parents can be so resistant to change. Gary's mother fought us for years before assisted living." The table chuckled softly. I didn't. Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside Vanessa, but stayed silent. Again. The conversation moved on, but my appetite disappeared. Then came the little comments. The tiny cuts, death by paper slices. Vanessa complimented Linda's lemon tart while barely touching my cobbler. One of the guests asked where I bought my sweater, and before I could answer, Linda smiled politely and said, "Phyllis likes vintage styles." Vintage. Another elegant insult. Later, Vanessa began showing vacation photos on her phone. Scottsdale, the same trip partially paid for with my money. Everyone admired the luxury resort, while I sat there quietly, trying not to remember the bank withdrawal receipt folded in my purse. Then Gary asked Ethan, "Did you finally handle those documents?" My eyes lifted instantly. Ethan froze for half a second. "Almost," he muttered. Vanessa gave him a warning glance so fast most people wouldn't have noticed it. "But I did," good Gary said casually. "Better to take care of these things early." My chest tightened slightly. "What documents?" I asked. Vanessa answered too quickly. "Oh, boring financial stuff." Then she changed the subject immediately. But something had shifted inside me. I started paying attention differently after that. Really paying attention. I noticed Ethan barely spoke unless Vanessa directed the conversation toward him. I noticed Linda constantly watching me with strange evaluation in her eyes. And twice during dinner, I caught Vanessa staring toward Ethan's leather folder sitting on the sideboard. The same folder from the night in the hook. The folder she kept checking like it contained something important or urgent. After dinner, everyone moved into the living room for coffee and dessert. I went into the kitchen alone to cut the cobbler. As I stood there slicing peaches and crust under warm yellow light, I suddenly heard voices from the hallway. Vanessa and Ethan. "You should have had her sign it already," Vanessa hissed quietly. I said, "I'm handling it. You're taking too long. She's my mother, and we're your family now." The words hit me like ice water. I froze completely. There was a long silence before Vanessa spoke again, softer this time. "You know what happens if this falls apart?" Footsteps approached the kitchen. I quickly focused on the pie before they entered. Vanessa smiled instantly when she saw me. "There you are. Need help." The speed at which that woman could transform herself terrified me. "No, thank you," I said carefully. For one brief second, our eyes locked, and I swear something dark flickered behind her smile. Not anger, calculation. Back in the dining room, dessert was served. Everyone complimented the bakery pastries, while my cobbler remained mostly untouched except for Lily's plate. Then Linda began discussing family inheritance issues after a friend's recent death. "It becomes complicated when older people don't organize things properly," she said. Vanessa nodded sympathetically, especially when emotions cloud judgment. I set my fork down slowly. Were they talking about me on purpose? Or had paranoia finally started poisoning my mind? Brian's wife turned to me kindly. "Do you still manage your finances yourself, Phyllis?" Before I could answer, Vanessa laughed again. "She insists on it. Insists. Like I was unreasonable for controlling my own money." The room suddenly felt too warm, too loud. My pulse began pounding strangely in my ears. Then Lily accidentally spilled juice near Ethan's leather folder. Vanessa reacted instantly. She snatched the folder off the table so quickly it startled everyone. My eyes narrowed. That wasn't normal. Inside the partially open folder, I caught a glimpse of paperwork. And my name. P.H. Phyllis Woods, typed in bold letters across the top. Something cold slid through my stomach. "What exactly is in that folder?" I asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Ethan looked trapped. Vanessa smiled too brightly. "Just insurance paperwork." My chest tightened harder. Sharp pressure spread beneath my ribs. I reached instinctively for the edge of the table. The room blurred slightly. "Phyllis," someone said distantly. Then Vanessa sighed. Actually sighed. And that was when she said it. Calmly. Coldly. "My family comes first, Phyllis. You're always last." Silence crashed over the room. I stared at her, unable to breathe properly. My own son sat there and said nothing. Not one word. The pressure in my chest exploded into pain. A crushing, terrifying pain that shot into my shoulder and jaw. I gasped. The dessert plate slipped from my hand and shattered against the hardwood floor. Grandma Lily cried. Suddenly voices erupted everywhere. "Call 911. "Oh my God. Phyllis, sit down." But through the chaos, through the panic and noise, I saw something I will never forget for the rest of my life. Vanessa glanced toward Ethan's leather folder, and for one tiny moment, she smiled. Not openly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But I saw it. Then she leaned close to Ethan and whispered something into his ear. Something that turned my blood cold, even as my vision darkened. This may actually help us. The ambulance ride felt strangely quiet. Not outside. Outside was chaos sirens screaming through Columbus traffic paramedics, speaking in urgent clipped voices, monitors beeping beside me. But inside my mind, silence. The kind that comes after something breaks permanently. I lay strapped to the narrow stretcher, staring at the ceiling lights passing overhead, while one terrible sentence repeated itself again and again. This may actually help us. Help them do what? A young paramedic named Chris kept asking questions. Ma'am, can you rate your pain from 1 to 10-8? I whispered. Any history of heart problems? No more stress recently, I almost laughed. Instead, tears slid quietly into my hair. Ethan rode in the front passenger seat of the ambulance. I could see his silhouette through the small opening near the driver's cabin, shoulders hunched forward. He never once turned around to look at me. Not once. By the time we reached Riverside Methodist Hospital, the pain medication had dulled the crushing ache in my chest, but emotionally, I felt flayed open. The emergency room lights were painfully bright. Nurses moved quickly around me, while machines monitored my heart rhythm. Possible cardiac event triggered by severe stress, one doctor said. Severe stress. Such clean clinical words for heartbreak. A few hours later, after blood work and scans, a calm woman in her early 50s entered my room. I'm Dr. Melissa Grant, she said gently. Your heart is stable, Phyllis, but you experienced significant cardiac stress. You're lucky this wasn't a full heart attack. Lucky. I nodded weakly. Dr. Grant pulled a chair closer beside my bed. I'm going to ask you something personal. Is there ongoing emotional pressure in your life? For some reason, that question almost broke me more than the chest pain itself. Nobody had asked if I was hurting emotionally in a very long time. I stared down at my trembling hands. My family situation is complicated. That complication nearly stopped your heart tonight. The bluntness stunned me. Doctors usually soften things. Not her. You need rest, she continued, and you need distance from whatever is causing this level of stress. I'm serious, Phyllis. Distance. The word felt impossible. How do mothers create distance from their own children? Around midnight, Ethan finally entered the room alone. For a moment, seeing him, there triggered old instincts inside me. Relief. Love. Concern for him even now. That's the tragedy of motherhood sometimes. Your heart continues protecting the people who are destroying it. He looked awful. Wrinkled shirt, bloodshot eyes, guilt written all over his face. Mom? I waited. He sat carefully in the chair beside the bed and rubbed his hands together nervously. I'm sorry about tonight. About tonight. Not about months, not years. Tonight. I looked at him quietly. What was in the folder? Ethan, his entire body stiffened. Insurance paperwork. The lie came too fast. I closed my eyes briefly. You used to be terrible at lying when you were little, I whispered. You'd blink too much. He swallowed hard. Mom, please don't do this right now. Right now. There it was again. Another delay. Another excuse. Another request for my silence. I turned my face toward the hospital window. Snow drifted softly outside under the parking lot lights. You sat there while your wife humiliated me? Vanessa didn't mean don't. My voice cracked. Please don't insult me by pretending that woman didn't mean every single word she said. Ethan looked down immediately. Cowardice again. Always cowardice. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then quietly, almost desperately, he said, She's under pressure. I actually stared at him in disbelief. Pressure. As if pressure explained cruelty. As if pressure explained watching me collapse and whispering that it might help. The memory sent another sharp wave through my chest. Dr. Grant had warned me to avoid stress, but how could I avoid it when the source of it shared my last name? Did you know I paid for your Arizona trip? I asked softly. Ethan froze. That told me everything. I was going to explain with what another emergency. His eyes filled instantly, and for one dangerous moment, my maternal instincts almost took over again. I almost comforted him, but then I remembered standing ankle deep in water, alone. I remembered my unused blanket in Vanessa's car. I remembered her smile while I struggled to breathe. Something inside me finally stopped bending. You should go home, I said quietly. Mom, I'm tired. He hesitated like he wanted to say more. Maybe he did. Maybe part of him genuinely hated what this had become. But in the end, he stood up silently and walked away, just like always. A nurse entered about 20 minutes later to check my vitals. You have someone else here asking to see you, she said. I frowned slightly. At this hour, he insisted it was important. A few moments later, an elderly man in a charcoal overcoat stepped carefully into the room carrying a leather briefcase. Richard Coleman, Daniel's attorney, and one of the oldest friends we had. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. His silver hair had thinned considerably, and deep lines marked his face, but his eyes remained sharp, very sharp. Phyllis, he said softly. Seeing him nearly made me cry. Richard. He closed the door behind him and sat beside the bed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Too many memories. Richard had handled our wills, taxes, and business paperwork for over 30 years. He was there the day Ethan was born. He attended Daniel's funeral, standing beside me in freezing rain. He wasn't just our lawyer, he was family. I heard what happened tonight, he said carefully. I gave a humorless laugh. News travels fast. His expression darkened slightly. No? Ethan called me. That surprised me. Why? Richard studied me for a long moment before answering. Because there are things you need to know. A chill spread through me immediately. He set the leather briefcase on his lap, but didn't open it yet. Before Daniel died, he began quietly. He updated several legal protections regarding your assets. My heartbeat quickened. Protections. Richard nodded slowly. Daniel became concerned during the last few months of his illness. Concerned about what he hesitated, then carefully chose his words. About Ethan's inability to stand up to certain people. Vanessa. Daniel knew. Oh God. He knew. Tears instantly blurred my vision. Why didn't he tell me he didn't want you carrying suspicion after he was gone? Richard said gently. He hoped he was wrong. I covered my mouth with trembling fingers, but deep down, Daniel had not been wrong, not even close. Richard finally opened the briefcase and removed a thick, sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. Seeing it nearly shattered me. I was instructed to give this to you only under very specific circumstances, Richard said quietly. What circumstances? His eyes met mine steadily. When I believe someone might be trying to manipulate you financially or legally. The room suddenly felt colder. What's happening, Richard? He exhaled slowly. Then he said the words that changed everything. Phyllis, your husband created a protected family trust before he died. I stared at him blankly. A trust? Yes. One worth substantially more than Ethan and Vanessa realize. My breath caught. Daniel had hidden money from me. Richard leaned closer. And there's something else you need to understand. His voice lowered carefully. Ethan does not automatically inherit it. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had misunderstood Richard. A protected trust, substantially more money. Ethan not automatically inheriting it. None of it sounded like Daniel. My husband had always been practical, straightforward, honest to a fault. He hated secrets. During 43 years of marriage, the man once gave me my Christmas present early because he felt guilty hiding it in the garage. And now I was learning he had quietly built an entire legal shield around our family before he died. Richard. My voice trembled. What are you talking about? He removed several documents from the briefcase, carefully placing them across the hospital blanket. This trust was established 8 months before Daniel passed away, he explained. He liquidated a portion of his remaining business assets, certain land investments, and 2 retirement accounts. I stared at him in disbelief. But why would he hide that from me? Richard's expression softened. Because he knew you, Phyllis. That answer hurt more than I expected. He loved your generosity, Richard continued gently. But Daniel also worried it would one day be used against you. I looked down at the papers again. Legal language blurred before my tired eyes. Daniel noticed changes after Vanessa entered the family, Richard said carefully. Not dramatic ones at first, but enough to concern him. Memories suddenly flooded back. Daniel watching Vanessa quietly across the dinner table. Daniel asking odd questions about Ethan's finances. Daniel insisting on reviewing old property records shortly before chemotherapy treatments began. At the time, I assumed he was simply trying to organize things before he died. Now I realized he had been preparing for something else entirely. Protecting me, even from beyond the grave. Richard handed me the sealed envelope with my name on it. You should read this when you're alone. I held the envelope carefully between trembling fingers. Daniel's handwriting looked exactly the same as always, firm, neat, dependable. Seeing it reopened grief I thought had scarred over years ago. What exactly are the conditions of this trust? I asked quietly. Richard hesitated. Then he answered with visible reluctance. Daniel created behavioral conditions for Ethan's inheritance. I blinked. Behavioral, yes. That sounds insane. Richard almost smiled sadly. It sounded protective. He adjusted his glasses and opened another file. The trust remains inaccessible unless Ethan demonstrates long-term financial responsibility, independent decision-making, and consistent emotional support toward you. I stared at him speechless. Daniel had literally turned morality into a legal requirement. He believed Ethan loved you deeply, Richard said softly, but he also believed Ethan was vulnerable to manipulation. Vulnerable. Such a polite word for weak. And if Ethan fails, I whispered. Richard met my eyes carefully. Then the trust remains under your sole control. My heart pounded unevenly again. How much money are we talking about? He named the amount quietly. I physically stopped breathing for a second. It was far more than I imagined possible. Not billionaire money, but enough to completely change lives. Enough to explain why Daniel hid it. Enough to explain why someone like Vanessa might become dangerous if she discovered it. I don't understand, I whispered. Vanessa doesn't know about this trust. No, Richard agreed slowly, but I believe she suspects something exists. Cold fear slid through me. What do you mean? Richard leaned back heavily in the chair. About 4 months ago, Ethan contacted me requesting copies of your estate paperwork. My stomach dropped. He said Vanessa wanted to help organize your future planning. Assisted living possibilities, financial management, things like that. The exact words Dr. Grant warned me about. The room suddenly felt smaller. I refused access without your authorization, Richard continued. Shortly afterward, I received another call, this time from Vanessa directly. I already hated where this was going. What did she say? She asked very specific questions about cognitive decline, protections, and financial guardianship. My pulse began racing. What? Richard's jaw tightened. She framed it as concern, but something about the conversation bothered me deeply. I thought about Vanessa constantly mentioning my age lately. The subtle comments about forgetfulness, the concern about overwhelming finances, the pressure to simplify my life. It suddenly formed a horrifying pattern. She's trying to make me look incompetent, I whispered. Richard didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. A long silence settled between us. Outside the hospital window, snow continued drifting slowly through the darkness. The city lights blurred softly beyond the glass. Finally, I asked the question haunting me most. Does Ethan know about the trust? Richard looked genuinely conflicted. He knows some assets exist. Some. Daniel informed him there would be conditions attached to inheritance after his death. I closed my eyes. So Ethan knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. The betrayal pierced deeper than I expected. All those conversations about helping me, all the pressure about finances, the mysterious documents. My son had known there was something to gain, and he never told me. He wouldn't hurt me, I whispered weakly. Richard sighed quietly. I don't think Ethan sees himself as hurting you. That sentence hit with devastating accuracy, because it was true. Ethan didn't operate like Vanessa. He wasn't calculating or openly cruel. He simply surrendered little pieces of himself until right and wrong blurred together. Cowards rarely think they're villains. They just keep avoiding difficult choices until the damage is irreversible. I failed him? I whispered suddenly. Richard frowned. Phyllis, I raised him to avoid conflict. Daniel used to say I protected Ethan from consequences too much. The memories came flooding back now. Every time Ethan forgot responsibilities as a child, I softened the punishment. Every time he struggled socially, I intervened. Every time life became uncomfortable for him, I stepped in front of the discomfort like a shield. I thought I was loving him. Maybe I was simply teaching him weakness. You loved your son, Richard said firmly. That is not failure. But I wasn't fully convinced anymore. A soft knock interrupted us. Dr. Melissa Grant entered carrying a tablet. She stopped when she saw the legal documents spread across my bed. Am I interrupting? No, I said quickly, though my voice sounded exhausted. She glanced between Richard and me with sharp professional intuition. You need rest, Phyllis. I almost laughed. Rest. As if rest were remotely possible now. Dr. Grant checked my chart quietly before speaking again. I reviewed your stress markers. You've been under chronic emotional strain for quite some time. Richard stood respectfully. I should go. Before leaving, he placed one final document beside me. This contains emergency legal instructions Daniel prepared years ago, he said quietly. Do not show anyone yet, especially not Ethan or Vanessa. Fear tightened inside me again. Richard, how bad do you think this really is? He paused at the door, and for the first time since entering the room, he looked genuinely worried. I think Daniel saw warning signs before any of us wanted to admit they existed. Then he left. Dr. Grant waited until the door closed before speaking. You don't have to tell me details, she said carefully, but I need to ask directly. Do you feel emotionally safe around your family? Emotionally safe. What a heartbreaking question. I stared down at Daniel's envelope, still resting in my lap. And suddenly, painfully honestly, I didn't know the answer anymore. Later that night, after the nurses dimmed the lights, I finally opened the letter. Inside was a handwritten note from my husband. The first line alone shattered me completely. My darling Phyllis. If you're reading this, then I was right to worry. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat upright in the hospital bed with Daniel's letter trembling in my hands while monitors beeped softly beside me. The handwriting alone felt alive, like somehow after all these years, my husband was still trying to protect me. I read the letter 3 times before dawn, and each time, different parts hurt in new ways. My darling Phyllis. If you're reading this, then I was right to worry. First, I need you to know something clearly. None of this is your fault. You love deeply. That has always been your greatest gift. But people who love deeply sometimes ignore danger because they cannot imagine cruelty in those they love. Ethan is not a bad man, but weakness in the wrong hands can become dangerous, especially when money, fear, and manipulation are involved. Please listen carefully to Richard, and for once in your life, choose yourself before everyone else. I love you, always. Daniel. By the end of the letter, I was crying so hard, a nurse quietly closed the door to give me privacy. Choose yourself before everyone else. I didn't even know how to do that anymore. Women of my generation weren't taught that skill. We were taught sacrifice, endurance, silence. The next morning, Ethan arrived carrying flowers and looking exhausted. He hesitated outside the doorway before entering, like he was afraid of me now. Good. Maybe he should be. How are you feeling? He asked carefully. Awake, I answered. He gave a weak smile that disappeared almost immediately. There was an awkward silence while he arranged flowers in the plastic hospital vase. Sunflowers. Daniel used to buy me sunflowers every anniversary because he said roses tried too hard. The memory stabbed straight through me. Finally, Ethan sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed. Vanessa feels terrible about what happened. I actually laughed. Not kindly. Does she... She didn't mean for things to escalate. Escalate. Interesting word choice. Like my collapse had been an unfortunate inconvenience rather than the result of prolonged emotional abuse. I studied my son carefully. Really studied him. His face looked older than 40 now. Stress lines around his eyes, exhaustion in his posture, the nervous habit of rubbing his wedding ring repeatedly. For the first time, I realized Ethan looked trapped too. But trapped people can still hurt others. Tell me the truth, I said quietly. His eyes lifted immediately. What truth? What documents were in that folder? His jaw tightened. Mom. No more excuses. He stood up suddenly and walked toward the window. That paperwork wasn't finalized. Cold dread crawled up my spine. What paperwork? He stayed facing away from me. There were discussions about another silence, then finally, future planning. I felt sick instantly. What kind of future planning? Ethan exhaled shakily. Vanessa thought maybe you needed more support lately. There it was. The script. The exact careful language manipulative people use. Support. Planning. Concern. Words that sound loving while quietly stealing control. I manage my own life perfectly well. I know that. Do you? He turned toward me, finally frustration breaking through his guilt. You don't understand how hard things have been lately. I stared at him in disbelief. Hard for him. You think I wanted any of this? He snapped. Vanessa's parents are constantly pressuring us about money. The house payments are insane. Lily's school tuition keeps increasing. So you decided your elderly mother should finance your lifestyle forever. His face crumpled immediately. That's not fair. I almost laughed again. Fair. What exactly had been fair lately? The lies? The stolen money? The humiliation? The secret legal discussions about my competency? Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the bedside table. Vanessa. Calling. Ethan saw the screen and immediately looked anxious. Aren't you going to answer? I asked quietly. She's worried. No. She was nervous. There's a difference. He stepped into the hallway to take the call. Through the partially open door, I could hear fragments of hushed conversation. No? She knows something. Okay, didn't tell her everything. Richard was there. My blood ran cold. When Ethan returned 5 minutes later, he looked even paler. Vanessa wants to come apologize. No. The answer came instantly. His eyes widened slightly. Mom. No. I had spent years softening myself to avoid making others uncomfortable. For once, the word felt strangely powerful. Ethan rubbed his forehead. You're making this harder. No, I said quietly. I'm finally making it honest. That shut him up. After he left, Dr. Grant stopped by again to review my discharge instructions. You're medically stable enough to go home tomorrow, she explained. But I need you to understand something, Phyllis. She pulled her chair closer. Stress like this doesn't happen overnight. It builds over time. People normalize emotional harm gradually. I looked away because that sentence described my life perfectly. She studied me carefully before continuing. Do you have someone trustworthy who can help monitor things at home? Trustworthy? That word suddenly felt complicated too. Richard Coleman, I said finally. She nodded approvingly. Good. Lean on him. By late afternoon, Richard himself arrived again, carrying another stack of documents, but this time his face looked grim. Very grim. What happened? I asked immediately. He closed the door carefully before answering. I did some checking this morning. Fear tightened instantly in my chest. Checking what court inquiries? I stared at him. Then slowly, horrifyingly, I understood. Oh my God. Richard nodded once. Vanessa contacted a family probate attorney 6 weeks ago. The room tilted. 6 weeks, she requested information about guardianship petitions involving elderly relatives. I covered my mouth. No. No, no, no. This couldn't be real. She was planning this before the dinner, I whispered. I believe so. Suddenly, dozens of strange moments from recent months rearranged themselves inside my memory like puzzle pieces finally clicking together. Vanessa insisting on attending my doctor appointments. Vanessa correcting me in conversations unnecessarily. Vanessa telling people I was forgetful lately. Vanessa offering to organize my bills. Even the Arizona trip. The money pressure, the manipulation. All of it was building toward something. She wants control, Richard said quietly. And once legal guardianship begins, it becomes much easier to influence property decisions. My breathing became shallow again. She wants my house. I think she wants everything connected to the Woods estate. Estate. Not family, not relationships. Assets. Tears burned my eyes again, but this time they felt different. Hotter. Angrier. What about Ethan? I whispered. Richard hesitated carefully. I don't believe he fully understands the severity of what's happening. But he signed papers. Yes. The answer hit like a knife. I looked down at my hands. My own son had signed documents questioning my competency. Even if manipulated, even if pressured. He still signed. A quiet knock interrupted us. Lily peeked through the doorway, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Behind her stood Ethan, looking nervous. "Grandma?" she asked softly. My heart melted instantly. Oh, sweetheart. She climbed carefully onto the bed beside me and wrapped tiny arms around my waist. "You scared me," she whispered. I kissed the top of her head. "I'm okay now." Then she said something that made every adult in the room go completely still. "Mommy says old people get confused and need other people to make choices for them." Silence. Pure, horrible silence. Ethan looked devastated. Richard slowly removed his glasses, and I felt something inside me finally harden completely. Because children always reveal the truth, adults try hiding. Lily hadn't invented those words. She heard them repeatedly, which meant Vanessa had been laying this groundwork for a very long time. I stroked Lily's hair gently while staring directly at my son. And for the first time since all this began, Ethan couldn't look me in the eye at all. When I returned home from the hospital 3 days later, I barely recognized my own house. Not physically, emotionally. The little brick home Daniel and I spent decades building together suddenly felt exposed somehow, like strangers had already been walking through it in their minds, deciding what to keep and what to sell. The winter air bit at my cheeks as Richard helped carry my overnight bag inside. "You don't have to stay," I told him quietly. "Yes," he said firmly, "I do." That answer alone nearly made me cry again. Because loyalty feels shocking once you've spent too long surrounded by manipulation. Richard insisted on checking the locks first. Then he carefully reviewed my mail stack, setting aside several envelopes immediately. "What is it?" I asked. "Credit card balance increase notices." My stomach sank. I barely use my cards. That's what concerns me. We sat together at my kitchen table while pale afternoon light filtered through the curtains. The house smelled faintly like cinnamon candles and old books, familiar, comforting smells that suddenly made me feel fragile. Richard slid the papers toward me carefully. Several charges had appeared within the last month that I didn't recognize. Furniture stores, travel bookings, online luxury retailers, thousands of dollars, all connected to Ethan's authorized user card, Richard said quietly. Authorized user. Another mistake born from trust. Years ago, after Daniel died, I gave Ethan emergency access to one of my credit accounts in case something happened to me unexpectedly. I never imagined emergency would eventually include spa resorts, and designer furniture. I want to revoke all access immediately, Richard said. But instead of agreeing right away, I surprised both of us by shaking my head. Not yet. He frowned deeply. Phyllis, I need to know how far this goes. And for the first time in weeks, something inside me shifted from grief into clarity. Pain can wake people up. That night, I made a decision that would have horrified the old version of me. I was going to pretend nothing had changed. The next morning, Vanessa arrived carrying soup and fake concern. I watched her through the front window before opening the door. Perfect hair, cream-colored wool coat, soft, sympathetic expression already prepared. An actress arriving on stage. "Oh, Phyllis," she said warmly the second I opened the door. "You gave us such a scare." Us. Interesting word. I stepped aside slowly. "Come in." Her eyes immediately swept across the house. Not casually, strategically. I noticed because now I was finally paying attention. People reveal themselves once you stop desperately trying to believe the best about them. Vanessa carried the soup container into the kitchen while speaking in that careful, soothing tone people use with nervous animals. "You should really be resting," she said. "Stress at your age is dangerous." There it was again. At your age? Always reminding me I was old, vulnerable, declining. I forced a tired smile and moved more slowly than necessary. "You're probably right," I said quietly. Something flickered behind her eyes. Satisfaction, very small, very quick, but unmistakable. Good. Let her think I was weaker than I really was. Vanessa spent the next hour performing concern so perfectly, it almost impressed me. She organized my medication bottles, adjusted couch pillows, repeatedly asked if I remembered to take my prescriptions. Every sentence quietly reinforced the same narrative: Phyllis is struggling. Phyllis is forgetful. Phyllis needs help. At one point, she opened my refrigerator and sighed dramatically. "Oh dear. You really shouldn't be living alone after this scare." I lowered my eyes deliberately. "I suppose things are getting harder." That got her attention immediately. "You've noticed that too?" The eagerness beneath her voice almost made me sick. I nodded weakly. Sometimes I lose track of things lately. Another lie? But necessary. Vanessa sat beside me instantly and took my hand. "Oh, Phyllis, you don't have to be embarrassed. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed she cared." That was the terrifying part. People like Vanessa survive because they know exactly how compassion is supposed to sound. Then came the moment that confirmed everything. "I actually brought some information," she said gently. My pulse slowed deliberately. What kind of information? She reached into her designer tote bag and removed a folder. "Paperwork." "Of course. I know this is difficult," she continued softly, "but after what happened at dinner, Ethan and I think maybe it's time to discuss getting you a little more support." Support. Such a poisonous word now. I pretended to study the papers with confusion. "These are just temporary arrangements," Vanessa explained quickly. "Financial assistance, healthcare coordination, maybe helping with household decisions." Household decisions? Meaning my money? My home? My life? I acted overwhelmed on purpose, rubbing my forehead lightly. "Oh goodness. Legal forms confuse me lately." Vanessa's eyes sharpened instantly. There it was again. That satisfaction. Like a hunter spotting weakness in wounded prey. "You don't need to worry about understanding everything," she said smoothly. "That's what family is for." Family. I almost laughed at the hypocrisy. Instead, I asked softly, "Would Ethan be in charge?" "Only to help protect you." "Protect me from what?" "My own independence." But I didn't challenge her. Not yet. Because now I needed proof. Over the following week, I leaned fully into the role. I moved slower, repeated questions occasionally, pretended to forget small details, and the more helpless I appeared, the bolder Vanessa became. She started arriving without calling first. She wandered through rooms freely. She opened drawers while assuming I wasn't paying attention. Twice I caught her photographing parts of the house with her phone. One afternoon, she brought Linda and Gary Mitchell over unexpectedly. I stayed upstairs quietly while they spoke downstairs, believing I was napping. That was their mistake, because old houses carry sound, especially through heating vents. "She'll never maintain this property alone," Linda said downstairs. Gary gave a low whistle. "This neighborhood's worth a fortune now." Then Vanessa's voice. "Once guardianship goes through, selling becomes much easier." My entire body went cold. Guardianship goes through. Not if. When. I carefully activated the voice recorder app Richard had installed on my phone earlier that week and moved silently toward the staircase. Their voices became clearer. Gary chuckled. "That property alone could set everyone up nicely." Linda lowered her voice slightly. "You need to move quickly before Richard Coleman interferes." Then Vanessa said the sentence that finally destroyed any remaining doubt inside me. "Ethan's too soft to handle this properly. If I leave it to him, nothing will ever get done." I nearly stopped breathing. Not because she insulted Ethan, because of the coldness in her tone. She wasn't talking about helping family anymore. She was discussing strategy, acquisition, control. And my son, my sweet, weak son, was merely another obstacle to manage. Suddenly, footsteps sounded near the stairs. I hurried back toward the guest bedroom just before Vanessa appeared in the hallway. "Oh," she said brightly. "You're awake." I blinked slowly, pretending confusion. I must have drifted off. Her eyes studied me carefully, searching, evaluating. "Did you hear us talking downstairs?" I forced a small, embarrassed smile. "Only bits and pieces. My hearing isn't what it used to be." That answer visibly relaxed her. Good. Let her underestimate me. As she helped me carefully down the stairs, Lily suddenly ran into the room carrying crayons. "Grandma," she said happily. Then innocently, loudly, Mommy says, "You might move away soon." Silence. Vanessa froze. And in that terrible quiet moment, I realized something else horrifying. They weren't just planning to control my finances. They were already planning my removal. After Lily's innocent little comment, the room changed instantly. Children have a way of exposing truths adults work desperately to hide. Vanessa recovered first, of course. She always did. "Oh, sweetheart," she laughed lightly, kneeling beside Lily Grandma's, not moving anywhere. "We were only talking about maybe getting her some extra help." Lily frowned. "But you told Daddy old people shouldn't live alone forever." Vanessa's smile tightened so quickly, most people wouldn't notice. I did. I noticed everything now. "That's enough," Lily Vanessa said gently, but firmly. The little girl looked confused and wandered toward the living room with her crayons. Silence settled heavily behind her. I lowered myself carefully into my armchair, pretending fatigue while secretly watching Vanessa's face. She looked nervous for the first time in weeks. Good. People become careless when they think they control the story, but they become dangerous once they realize they might not. "You've all been discussing my future quite a bit," I said quietly. Vanessa immediately softened her expression again. "Because we care about you." The lie slid out effortlessly. I used to wonder whether manipulative people felt guilt. Now I think the scariest ones don't. They simply rewrite reality until they become the hero in their own mind. "I know aging is frightening," Vanessa continued softly. "But Ethan and I only want you safe." Safe. Another poisoned word. I nodded slowly, like a tired old woman struggling to process information. "That's kind of you." Relief visibly flickered across her face. She still believed I was confused. Still believed she was winning. Perfect. That evening after they left, Richard arrived again, carrying groceries and legal folders. The poor man looked more exhausted every day. When I played him the recording from earlier, his expression darkened immediately. "She's moving faster than I expected," he muttered. "Can they really force me out of my home?" "Not legally, not yet," he said firmly. "But psychological pressure matters. If they create enough documentation suggesting cognitive decline, courts sometimes take temporary measures while evaluating competency. Temporary measures. I suddenly understood how older people lose control of their lives piece by piece, not through dramatic violence, through paperwork, concern, procedures, people smiling sympathetically while removing your independence. I need to confront Ethan, I whispered. Richard shook his head immediately. No. I stared at him. He's my son, and right now he's emotionally compromised. That phrase hurt because it was true. Ethan wasn't thinking clearly anymore. He was drowning in financial pressure, manipulated by Vanessa, terrified of conflict, and desperate to keep everyone happy. Weak people become dangerous when they fear disappointing others, especially manipulative spouses. I still think he doesn't fully understand what she's doing, I said quietly. Richard sighed heavily, maybe not consciously. The next morning proved him right. Ethan arrived alone, looking pale and anxious. I need to talk to you, he said immediately. I invited him inside carefully. For a moment, seeing him standing in Daniel's old living room triggered memories so strong they almost physically hurt. Little Ethan building blanket forts on this carpet. Teenage Ethan asleep on the couch after basketball practice. 22-year-old Ethan crying in this exact room after his first serious heartbreak. I had spent a lifetime protecting that boy, but the man standing before me now felt like someone I barely recognized. He paced nervously before finally blurting out, "Vanessa thinks you're turning everyone against her." I stared at him slowly. Interesting. She's scared, Mom. Of what? Losing access to my bank accounts. His face flinched. So he knew? At least partially. She didn't mean things the way they sound. There are recordings, Ethan? Silence. Pure silence. He stopped pacing immediately. What recordings? I held his gaze. The ones where your wife discusses selling my house after guardianship. His face drained completely white. For a second, I genuinely thought he might collapse. That's not she wouldn't. She did. He sat down heavily, like his legs stopped working. I watched devastation spread slowly across his face. Not devastation because he discovered evil. Devastation because deep down, he already suspected it. I never wanted this, he whispered. I believed him. And somehow that almost made it sadder. Then why did you sign those papers? He covered his face with both hands, because everything became impossible. I waited quietly, and finally, after months of silence and excuses, the truth began spilling out. Vanessa and Ethan were drowning financially, not because they were poor, because they were living far beyond their means. The luxury vacations, private school tuition, country club memberships, designer purchases, social pressure from the Mitchell family. Every expensive decision created another layer of debt. She kept saying we deserved a better life, Ethan whispered. And every time I got nervous about money, she'd say your estate would eventually solve everything. Estate. There it was again. Not my well-being, not family, assets. I told her we shouldn't depend on that, Ethan continued miserably. But then things got worse financially. Gary introduced me to investments that failed. Credit card debt exploded, and Vanessa kept saying if we could just manage things temporarily, manage me. I corrected quietly. Tears filled his eyes immediately. I didn't think it would go this far. That sentence broke something inside me. Because harm doesn't require evil intentions. Sometimes weakness alone destroys people. Did you know she was researching guardianship? His silence answered before he did. Oh my God, I whispered. I thought it was temporary, he said desperately. Just until we stabilized financially. Temporary. Another word people use while stealing permanent things. I stood slowly and walked toward the fireplace, where Daniel's photograph rested beside winter candles. My husband's calm eyes stared back at me from another lifetime. You know what hurts most? I asked softly, without turning around. Ethan said nothing. It's not the money. My voice cracked slightly. It's realizing my son watched someone slowly erase my dignity, and kept hoping it would somehow work itself out. Behind me, I heard him begin crying quietly. Real crying. The kind men tried desperately to hide. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Mom, I swear I'm sorry." I closed my eyes, and for one dangerous second, I almost forgave him immediately. Because mothers are conditioned to rescue, even when we're the ones drowning. Then my phone buzzed on the coffee table. Vanessa. Again. This time, Ethan looked terrified when he saw her name. "Answer it," I said quietly. He hesitated. "Answer it." Slowly, he picked up. I could hear Vanessa's voice immediately through the speaker. "Did she say anything to you?" Ethan glanced at me nervously. "No. She's lying about something," Vanessa snapped. "Richard Coleman's poisoning her against us." Us. Interesting choice again. Not me and Ethan. Us. Like they were a united front against an opponent. Then Vanessa said something that finally shattered whatever remained of Ethan's denial. "If we lose control now, everything falls apart." Control? Not helping, not caring. Control. I watched my son's entire face change in real time, the illusion finally cracking completely. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Ethan looked truly afraid of his own wife. 3 days later, Vanessa invited everyone to what she called a family meeting. That phrase alone made my stomach tighten. Family meeting. As if this were some loving discussion instead of a carefully staged ambush. The invitation arrived through Ethan in a strained phone call the night before. "She just wants everyone together," he said weakly. Why long? Silence. Then quietly, "She thinks things have gotten out of hand." Things. Not betrayal, not manipulation. Things. I almost refused to go, but Richard insisted I attend. "Predators become reckless when they think victory is close," he said calmly. Let her believe that. So the next evening, I drove slowly to Ethan and Vanessa's house, under a gray Ohio sky, heavy with snow clouds. Richard followed behind me in his own car. We didn't enter together. That was intentional. Vanessa opened the front door, wearing soft beige cashmere and a sympathetic smile so polished it almost looked painful. "Phyllis," she said warmly, "I'm so glad you came." The performance had begun. I stepped inside quietly. The house smelled like expensive candles and roasted garlic. Soft instrumental music played in the background. Everything looked warm, elegant, welcoming. Manufactured comfort. The dining room table had been transformed into what looked disturbingly close to a legal consultation. Folders, documents, pens carefully arranged. Linda and Gary Mitchell already sat there drinking wine. Ethan stood near the kitchen island, looking pale and exhausted. The second our eyes met, guilt flashed across his face again. Good. He should feel it. "Sit down, sweetheart," Linda said in that false, sugary tone I had come to despise. Sweetheart. People always become extra affectionate right before they try stealing something from you. I lowered myself carefully into a chair, deliberately moving slower than usual. Vanessa immediately noticed. Her eyes sharpened with quiet satisfaction. Perfect. Let her think I was fragile. "We're all worried about you," Vanessa began gently once everyone settled. No one mentioned Richard yet. That amused me. They truly thought they could corner me before he arrived. Gary folded his hands dramatically. "At your age, stability matters more than independence." There it was again. Age. Always age. Like growing older automatically erased personhood. I said nothing. Silence makes manipulative people nervous. So Vanessa kept talking. "You've been through so much lately," she said softly. "The hospital scare really opened our eyes." Our eyes? Interesting how my medical emergency somehow became about them. "We just want to make sure you're protected," she continued. Then she slid a thick document toward me. There it was. The trap. I glanced at the heading. Temporary Financial Guardianship Authorization. Even seeing the words made my chest feel cold. Vanessa leaned closer, sympathetically. "This doesn't take away your freedom, Phyllis. It simply allows Ethan to help manage things while you recover." Recover from what exactly? Being emotionally abused by them. You've seemed overwhelmed lately, Linda added carefully. And forgetful Gary chimed in. Forgetful. The script again. Repeated enough times that eventually other people start believing it too. I looked down at the paperwork slowly, pretending confusion. So Ethan would control my finances. Temporarily, Vanessa said quickly. There are also healthcare protections, Linda added. Healthcare protections, meaning medical decisions, meaning control over where I lived. My fingers tightened slightly against the table beneath the documents. I suddenly imagined myself trapped in some assisted living facility while strangers sold Daniel's house. My house. The home where my husband died holding my hand. Rage rose so quickly inside me it almost frightened me. But I kept my face calm, weak, uncertain. That was safer for now. Ethan finally spoke, voice strained. Mom, nobody's trying to hurt you. I turned slowly toward him. Then why was Vanessa researching guardianship before I ever got sick? Dead silence. Vanessa's expression flickered for just half a second. There. Fear. Real fear. Excuse me, she said carefully. I know about the probate attorney. Linda immediately jumped in. Oh, Phyllis, you must be misunderstanding. No, I interrupted quietly. I understand far more than all of you think. The room shifted instantly. The fake warmth cracked. Vanessa straightened slightly in her chair. What exactly are you accusing us of interesting? Not concerned. Defensive? I folded my hands calmly. I'm asking why my daughter-in-law repeatedly told people I was mentally declining before any doctor ever suggested such a thing. Ethan looked physically sick now. Good. Let him hear it clearly for once. Vanessa gave a small wounded laugh. This is unbelievable. After everything we've tried to do for you? For me? I asked softly. My calmness unsettled her more than anger would have. Yes, she snapped slightly. You nearly had a heart attack, Phyllis. You can't keep pretending nothing's changing. There it was, the first crack in her mask tonight. Linda touched Vanessa's arm dramatically. She's confused, honey. Don't upset her further. Confused. Again. Repeated strategically. I suddenly understood how gaslighting works on elderly people over time. Not through one dramatic lie, through endless repetition. You're tired. You forgot. You misunderstood. You're emotional. Until eventually you start questioning your own reality. But not anymore. Not me. Vanessa pushed the documents closer. If you just sign these, everyone could relax. Everyone. Meaning them? I picked up the pen slowly, and every person at that table visibly leaned forward. Hungry. That's the only word for it now. Hungry people watching a door finally open. Ethan looked miserable. Linda looked eager. Gary looked calculating. And Vanessa. Vanessa looked triumphant, like she could already see herself winning. I uncapped the pen carefully. Then I asked one final question. If I sign this, what happens next? Vanessa answered too quickly. We'd gradually help transition you into more supported living arrangements. Transition. Not move, not remove, transition. Another carefully sanitized word. I stared directly into her eyes. And sell my home. Nobody answered immediately, which answered everything. The silence stretched. Then Gary cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, maintaining a property that size alone may eventually become impractical. There it was. Finally. The truth sitting naked at the table. Not concern. Real estate. Assets. Control. I placed the pen down gently, and at that exact moment, the front door opened. Richard Coleman stepped inside, carrying his leather briefcase. The entire room froze. Vanessa stood abruptly. What is he doing here? Richard removed his coat slowly, calmly. I was invited. No, you weren't, she snapped. I was, I said quietly. That shut her up instantly. Richard entered the dining room like a man walking into court. Steady, prepared, dangerous. He placed the briefcase carefully on the table beside the guardianship paperwork and looked directly at Vanessa. I think before Phyllis signs anything, he said calmly, everyone here deserves to review some additional documentation. For the first time since this nightmare began, I watched genuine panic enter Vanessa Mitchell Wood's eyes. The room went completely silent after Richard spoke. Not uncomfortable silence, dangerous silence. The kind where everyone suddenly realizes the situation is no longer under control. Vanessa recovered first naturally. She crossed her arms tightly and forced a laugh that sounded brittle around the edges. "This is absurd," she said. "We're trying to help Phyllis, not put her on trial." Richard calmly removed several folders from his briefcase. "Excellent," he replied evenly. "Then transparency shouldn't be a problem." I almost smiled. Watching Richard Coleman dismantle manipulative people was like watching an old lion wake up. Slow, steady, lethal. Ethan looked trapped between terror and shame. Linda and Gary exchanged nervous glances. For the first time since entering the room, the Mitchell family no longer looked confident. Good. Richard laid the first document carefully on the table. This, he said calmly, is a formal record of inquiries made regarding guardianship proceedings for Phyllis Woods. Vanessa's face immediately hardened. That proves nothing. No, Richard agreed. But this might. He slid another document forward. Bank statements, highlighted charges, travel expenses, luxury purchases, credit card records tied directly to my accounts. Ethan closed his eyes instantly. Gary's face lost color. Vanessa didn't even look surprised anymore. Interesting. That told me she already knew exactly how much evidence existed. Over $47,000 in undocumented spending connected to Phyllis Woods' accounts over the last 18 months, Richard continued. Linda spoke sharply. Ethan had authorized access. Yes, Richard said calmly, for emergencies, not luxury vacations and personal investments. Vanessa leaned forward aggressively. Everything Ethan accessed was family-related. Family. Always family when money was involved. I looked at her quietly. Was the Scottsdale resort family-related? She faltered for half a second. Tiny. But enough. Richard opened another folder. And now we move to the more concerning issue. The room tightened again instantly. He removed a small digital recorder from the briefcase. Vanessa's eyes widened. What is that? My pulse quickened despite myself. Richard looked directly at her. A recording. The word landed like a gunshot. Ethan stared at me slowly, and in that moment, he understood. I had heard them. I had recorded them. I watched horror spread across his face, not because he feared punishment, because he finally realized how unsafe I must have felt to start secretly documenting my own family. Richard pressed play. Gary's voice filled the dining room first. That property alone could set everyone up nicely. Then, Linda, you need to move quickly before Richard Coleman interferes. Vanessa's voice came next. Once guardianship goes through, selling becomes much easier. Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the final sentence played. Ethan's too soft to handle this properly. If I leave it to him, nothing will ever get done. Click. The recording ended. I looked at Ethan. His face looked shattered. Not angry, destroyed. Because hearing betrayal privately is one thing. Hearing it spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses is another. Vanessa stood abruptly. You recorded us in private? That's sick. I almost laughed at the hypocrisy. You were planning to remove me from my home. We were trying to protect you by discussing property values before my health. Her mouth snapped shut. Richard folded his hands calmly. There's more. Vanessa turned toward him sharply. No. That single word came out too fast, too frightened. Richard ignored her. He removed printed email copies from another folder. These communications, he said, were recovered through authorized financial review after suspicious account activity. Vanessa's breathing visibly quickened now. Linda whispered, "What emails?" Richard slid the papers across the table. I watched Linda begin reading, then watched the blood drain from her face. Gary grabbed the pages next. Ethan stood slowly and took one copy himself. And then finally, he saw the truth in black and white. Messages between Vanessa and her parents. Discussions about my property, my savings, my decline, possible timelines. One line in particular made Ethan physically stagger backward. Once she's out of the house, everything becomes easier. The exact sentence from my recording. Repeated again in writing. Not emotional, not accidental. Planned. Vanessa suddenly slammed her hand against the table. Fine, she snapped. You want honesty? Fine. There she was. The real Vanessa. No soft voice. No careful concern. No polished mask. Just rage. I am tired of pretending this situation is normal. She exploded. Your mother is sitting on a fortune while we drown. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. You told me this wasn't about money. Oh, please. She laughed bitterly. Everything is about money eventually. The room felt ice cold. Vanessa pointed toward me. She lives alone in a house that could solve half our problems while we struggle every single month. You created those problems, I said quietly. No, she snapped. Your generation created them. Linda tried to interrupt nervously. Vanessa. But she was beyond stopping now. Years of resentment came pouring out all at once. She acts helpless enough for sympathy, but strong enough to control everything, Vanessa said viciously. Do you know how frustrating it is watching someone hoard assets they barely use, while younger families suffer hoard assets? That's how she saw my life. Not memories, not sacrifices, assets. Ethan looked physically ill. You manipulated me, he whispered. Vanessa turned toward him sharply. Oh, don't start acting innocent now. You signed the papers too. That hit him like a slap. And because cruel people panic when cornered. She kept going. You think I forced you to use her credit cards? She snapped. You enjoyed the lifestyle just as much as I did. Ethan's eyes filled with tears instantly. Maybe because it was partially true. That's the ugliness of manipulation sometimes. It attaches itself to real weaknesses. You said we were protecting her, he whispered. Vanessa laughed harshly. She's not dying tomorrow, Ethan. But eventually, yes, this all becomes ours anyway. Ours. Not his mother's. Not Lily's future. Ours. I looked at the woman I once welcomed into my family and realized something painful. She never loved us. She loved access. Richard stood slowly. At this point, he said calmly, I strongly advise ending this conversation before further legal complications arise. But the damage was already done, because Lily appeared silently in the hallway, clutching her stuffed rabbit, and based on her frightened face, she had heard enough. Mommy, she whispered. Every adult froze. Vanessa immediately softened her expression again. Sweetheart, go upstairs. But Lily didn't move. Her little eyes shifted toward me instead. Are they taking Grandma's house away? The innocence in her voice nearly broke me. Nobody answered. Then Lily said something so simple and so devastating that the entire room collapsed emotionally around it. But Grandma's family. Silence. Pure, horrible silence. Ethan covered his face and began sobbing quietly. Actual sobbing. Years of denial finally breaking open. Vanessa looked furious now, not guilty. Furious. Because the performance had failed. Because control was slipping away. Because witnesses existed now. Not just me. Everyone. I slowly stood from my chair despite the ache in my chest. And for the first time in months, I no longer felt weak. I looked directly at Vanessa. You said your family comes first. My voice stayed calm, steady. But you forgot something important. She stared back at me silently. You were never protecting your family. I glanced toward Lily. You were destroying it. The fallout came fast. Faster than I expected. Within 48 hours of the family meeting, Vanessa moved out of the house she shared with Ethan and took Lily to stay temporarily with her parents in Cincinnati. Not because she felt ashamed, because she was preparing for war. That became painfully clear 3 days later when Richard called me early in the morning. His voice sounded unusually tense. "Phyllis," he said carefully, "you've been served." My stomach dropped instantly. "Served with what? A petition challenging your competency." I closed my eyes. Of course she did. When manipulation failed privately, she escalated publicly. Richard arrived at my house an hour later, carrying legal paperwork thick enough to make my hands shake. Vanessa was formally requesting emergency court review regarding my mental and financial capacity. Her claim stated that I was emotionally unstable, increasingly confused, vulnerable to outside influence, and being manipulated by Richard for control of my estate. Estate? Always the estate. Never once did the filing mention love, or concern, or family, only management, assets, protection. I sat silently at my kitchen table while Richard reviewed the documents. "She's aggressive," he admitted grimly, "but not unbeatable." I laughed bitterly. "She's trying to erase me while I'm still alive." Richard didn't disagree. That hurt more than anything. The next few weeks became a nightmare of evaluations, paperwork, and humiliation. Doctor's appointments, financial reviews, legal interviews, questions designed to make me sound fragile. Do you ever forget where you place things? How often do you feel emotional? Have you experienced confusion recently? The worst part was realizing how easily normal aging can be twisted into evidence. Misplace your glasses once. Concerning. Cry after betrayal. Emotionally unstable. Need help understanding complicated legal forms. Potential decline. I suddenly understood why so many elderly people surrender. The process itself exhausts you into helplessness. Meanwhile, Vanessa transformed completely. Publicly, she became the image of the worried daughter-in-law. Concerned, heartbroken, protective. She even posted vague social media messages about the painful responsibility of caring for aging loved ones. Hundreds of people praised her compassion. I wanted to scream. Instead, I sat in my living room, staring at my phone, while strangers called the woman destroying me an angel. Ethan moved into a small apartment near his office during the separation. For nearly 2 weeks, I barely heard from him. Part of me was furious. Another part understood exactly what was happening. He was drowning in shame. One rainy Thursday evening, he finally showed up at my front door, looking like he hadn't slept properly in days. His clothes hung wrinkled on his body. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. For a second, I saw the little boy he used to be again. Lost. Frightened. "I know you probably don't want to see me," he said quietly. I almost said no. Almost. But old habits die slowly. I stepped aside silently. Ethan entered the house carefully, like someone walking through sacred ground after committing a crime. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table for several long minutes before he finally spoke. "She filed for temporary emergency authority yesterday." "I know." His jaw tightened painfully. "I told her not to. Not enough." That phrase no longer impressed me. Not when my entire life had nearly been dismantled by his inability to act. "She says Richard's manipulating you against the family." I stared at him slowly. The family. He looked down immediately. Right. Because even now, he still unconsciously separated me from the unit he built with Vanessa. The realization hurt more than I expected. "I never thought things would get this ugly," he whispered. "Ugly," I repeated softly. "Ethan, your wife is trying to convince a court I'm incapable of controlling my own life." Tears filled his eyes instantly. "I know." No. He didn't know? Not really. Because unless someone has tried stripping away your independence while smiling sympathetically, they cannot fully understand that kind of terror. I folded my hands together tightly to stop them shaking. "Do you know what frightens me most?" He looked up slowly. "Not losing money?" My voice cracked slightly. losing the right to decide where I live, who I trust, what happens to me. He covered his face. I'm so sorry. And there it was again. Sorry. Always after damage. Never before. I studied my son quietly for a long moment. Then I finally asked the question sitting inside me for weeks. When did you stop seeing me as a person? His head jerked upward instantly. What you heard Vanessa discussing my property before she discussed my health. You watched her reduce me into a financial solution, and instead of protecting me, my voice broke. You negotiated with it. That sentence destroyed him. He actually began crying openly now. I hated myself every second he whispered. Then why didn't you stop? The answer came after a long silence. Because I was scared. Simple, honest, pathetic, and devastating. Scared of debt, scared of conflict, scared of losing his marriage, scared of disappointing Vanessa. So instead, he sacrificed me slowly. That realization settled heavily between us. Finally, Ethan whispered something I never expected to hear. I think Vanessa planned this long before the hospital. I went still. What do you mean? He swallowed hard. She started asking about your finances almost immediately after Dad died. Cold dread spread through me again. At first it sounded harmless. He continued. Retirement planning, estate preparation, future support. Then his face twisted painfully. But over time, it became obsessive. He admitted Vanessa constantly compared my lifestyle to theirs, complained about wasted wealth, resented my refusal to sell the house, even criticized my spending on small personal things while they struggled financially. She used to say things like, he stopped. Say it. Ethan closed his eyes. She'd say, your generation keeps resources locked away while younger families suffer. Exactly what she exploded about during the confrontation. So this wasn't sudden. It was ideology. Entitlement wrapped in moral justification. And perhaps the most painful truth of all, part of Ethan eventually started believing her. I failed you, he whispered. The raw honesty in his voice nearly shattered me. Because for once, he wasn't making excuses anymore, just admitting truth. The rain outside intensified softly against the kitchen windows. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan said quietly, I'm willing to testify if it goes to court. I stared at him in shock. What? She used me too, he said hollowly. And if I don't tell the truth now, then I become exactly the kind of man Dad feared I'd turn into. Daniel. Even now, my husband's shadow still lingered over all of this. I looked toward his photograph on the mantel. Strong, steady, everything Ethan struggled to become. I don't know if I can forgive you, I admitted honestly. Fresh tears filled Ethan's eyes. I know, and forgiveness wouldn't erase what happened. I know, but my voice trembled. You're still my son. That sentence broke both of us. Because love doesn't vanish simply because trust does. That's the tragedy of family betrayal. You still love the people who wound you, sometimes forever. Ethan left shortly after midnight. Before leaving, he paused near the front door and looked back at me carefully. She's going to fight hard, he warned quietly. I believed him, because Vanessa had never truly cared about family, only winning. And people like that rarely surrender gracefully. The courthouse smelled like old paper floor polish and anxiety. I remember that vividly. Funny what the mind holds onto during moments that change your life. Richard walked beside me through the security checkpoint, carrying two heavy legal binders, while snow drifted outside the tall courthouse windows. You ready? He asked quietly. No, I wasn't ready. How could anyone be ready to sit in a courtroom while strangers debated whether they deserved control over their own life? But I nodded anyway, because fear had already taken enough from me. The hearing took place in a smaller probate courtroom on the third floor. No jury, no dramatic television-style spectacle, just quiet devastation wrapped in legal language. Judge Eleanor Harper sat at the front reviewing paperwork through thin reading glasses. She looked to be around my age, silver hair neatly pinned back, calm eyes, sharp with intelligence. For some reason, seeing an older woman in control steadied me slightly. Vanessa sat across the room beside her attorney, looking flawless in a navy suit. Perfect posture, soft makeup, concerned expression carefully arranged. The grieving daughter-in-law performance again. Only now I could see every movement for what it truly was: strategy. Linda and Gary sat behind her, looking tense. Ethan hadn't arrived yet. That worried me more than I wanted to admit. The hearing began formally. Vanessa's attorney, a smooth man named Carl Benson, stood first. Your Honor? He began sympathetically. This case concerns the protection of a vulnerable elderly woman suffering clear emotional instability following significant health trauma. Vulnerable elderly woman. Interesting how quickly a lifetime of experience disappears once people want your autonomy. Benson continued describing my hospital incident, emotional distress, erratic behavior, and supposed cognitive decline. Every painful moment of my life became evidence against me. Crying after betrayal, emotional instability, distrusting people secretly plotting against me, paranoia, recording conversations, confusion, and fear. I sat there gripping my hands tightly while strangers dissected my sanity. Then came the worst part. Vanessa took the stand, and I watched the woman I once welcomed into my family look directly at the judge with tears in her eyes. I love Phyllis, she whispered emotionally. This has been heartbreaking for all of us. Liar. But she sounded convincing. That's what made people like her dangerous. Not loud cruelty, controlled compassion. She's become increasingly forgetful, Vanessa continued. Sometimes she repeats conversations or becomes suspicious over harmless misunderstandings. Harmless misunderstandings. Like trying to take my house? Vanessa dabbed delicately at her eyes. We only wanted to help her feel safe. Judge Harper listened quietly without reacting. Good. I trusted silent women more than emotional performances. Then Benson introduced carefully selected examples. My emotional reaction at dinner, my stress-induced cardiac episode, the recordings, my recent anxiety. Each piece twisted carefully into a narrative of decline. By the time they finished speaking, I almost felt exhausted enough to believe it myself. That's the terrifying power of gaslighting. It doesn't just convince others. Eventually, it tries convincing you. Richard stood next. And suddenly, the atmosphere changed completely. Unlike Benson's polished emotional storytelling, Richard spoke with calm precision. Your Honor, he said evenly, this case is not about protecting Phyllis Woods. He turned slowly toward Vanessa. It is about controlling her. Simple, direct, true. Richard began presenting financial evidence methodically. Unauthorized charges, travel expenses, recorded conversations, probate inquiries, legal consultations predating my hospital stay. Each document chipped away at Vanessa's carefully constructed image. Her expression remained controlled, but I noticed her fingers tightening repeatedly around her pen. Then Richard called Dr. Melissa Grant to testify. My cardiologist walked calmly to the stand carrying medical files. Dr. Grant, Richard asked, in your professional opinion, does Phyllis Woods suffer from cognitive impairment? No. Clear. Immediate. No hesitation whatsoever. Does she demonstrate signs of dementia? No. Has she shown confusion regarding financial understanding or personal decision-making? Absolutely not. Vanessa's attorney stood quickly. But stress can impair judgment, temporarily correct. Stress can affect anyone temporarily, Dr. Grant replied calmly, including younger adults. A few quiet chuckles moved through the courtroom. Vanessa's jaw tightened slightly. Then came the question that changed everything. Dr. Richard asked carefully, what was the primary cause of Mrs. Woods's medical crisis? Dr. Grant looked directly toward the judge. Prolonged emotional stress caused by family-related psychological pressure. Psychological pressure. Hearing a medical professional validate my experience nearly made me cry, because abuse hidden behind concern is still abuse, even in expensive clothes, even with polite voices. Vanessa's attorney attempted recovery by suggesting I had become emotionally dependent on Richard after Daniel's death. That angered me more than anything else so far, as if older women automatically become irrational whenever they trust someone protecting them. Judge Harper finally turned toward me directly. "Mrs. Woods," she said gently, "would you like to speak?" My throat tightened instantly, but I stood slowly, and for the first time in months, I stopped feeling ashamed. I spent my whole life caring for other people. I began quietly. The courtroom fell completely silent. I worked as a nurse for 35 years. I buried my husband after cancer. I raised my son to believe family mattered above everything. My voice shook slightly, but somewhere along the way, caring for people became permission for them to stop caring about me. Vanessa stared down at the table now. I continued. "I am emotional, Your Honor." "Of course I am. Anyone would be emotional after discovering their family discussed selling their home while questioning their sanity." Judge Harper watched me very carefully. "I may be aging," I said softly, "but aging is not incompetence." Silence filled the room. Then suddenly, the courtroom doors opened. Everyone turned. Ethan. He stood there breathing hard like he'd run through the courthouse. Vanessa's face changed instantly. Fear. Real fear. Because she already knew why he came. "Mr. Woods, Judge," Harper said calmly, "you're late." "I'm sorry, Your Honor," Ethan whispered. Then he looked directly at me, and I saw something different in his eyes finally. Not confusion, not weakness, decision. Richard slowly nodded toward him. Ethan walked to the witness stand like a man approaching his own execution, because in many ways, he was. Vanessa's attorney looked alarmed immediately. "Your Honor, we were not informed." "I'm aware," Judge Harper interrupted calmly. "Proceed." Ethan sat down heavily. His hand shook visibly. Then Richard asked the question softly. "Mr. Woods, did your wife ever discuss plans regarding your mother's property before concerns about her health emerged?" Long silence. The entire courtroom held its breath. Vanessa stared at him in open panic now. And finally, "My son told the truth. Yes." The word shattered the room. Ethan swallowed hard. "She talked about my mother's assets long before the hospital incident, long before guardianship discussions." Vanessa whispered sharply, "Ethan." But he kept going. Tears filled his eyes. "She manipulated me," he admitted painfully. "But I also let it happen because I was scared and financially desperate." Judge Harper watched him carefully. Ethan's voice broke completely now. "My father warned me once that weakness can hurt people just as badly as cruelty." I felt tears sliding down my face, because Daniel had been right all along, and because at long last, our son finally understood it too. Judge Harper's ruling came 3 weeks later. Those 3 weeks felt longer than the entire previous year. I barely slept. Every phone call made my stomach tighten. Every envelope in the mailbox felt dangerous. Even though Richard remained confident, fear still lived inside me now in ways I couldn't easily undo. That's the thing about betrayal. Even after the threat passes, your nervous system remembers. On the morning of the ruling, snow covered Columbus in soft, white silence. I stood at my kitchen window, holding coffee I'd forgotten to drink, while watching flakes drift across Daniel's old maple tree in the backyard. This house had witnessed almost my entire adult life: birthdays, arguments, Christmas mornings, cancer, grief, love, and nearly losing it all. Richard arrived shortly after 8, wearing the same charcoal overcoat he always seemed to wear during difficult moments. "You ready?" he asked gently. "No," but this time I smiled faintly anyway, more than I was before. The courthouse felt calmer that day, or maybe I did. Judge Harper entered exactly at 9 o'clock, carrying her ruling folder. Vanessa sat rigidly beside her attorney, jaw tight with tension. She looked exhausted now, The polished perfection was cracking. Meanwhile, Ethan sat alone behind Richard and me. No wedding ring anymore. That sight hurt more than I expected. Not because I wanted him back with Vanessa, but because broken families leave wreckage behind, even when justice wins. Judge Harper adjusted her glasses and began reading calmly. The court found no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment, no medical basis for guardianship, no justification for emergency authority. Instead, the ruling specifically referenced patterns of financial exploitation, coercive influence, and emotional manipulation directed toward me. Hearing those words spoken formally in court nearly brought me to tears, because for months I'd been made to feel irrational, paranoid, difficult, and now the truth existed publicly, officially. Judge Harper didn't stop there. She also ordered full revocation of Ethan's financial access to my accounts and recommended further investigation into unauthorized spending. Vanessa's face went completely pale. Then came the final blow. The judge directly criticized the misuse of protective concern as a tool for financial control over an elderly family member. I saw Vanessa's attorney close his eyes briefly. They had lost badly. When the hearing ended, people began gathering papers quietly while courtroom murmurs filled the air. Vanessa stood abruptly. For 1 second, I thought she might approach me. Instead, she turned sharply toward Ethan. "This is your fault. No sadness. No accountability. Just blame." Ethan looked exhausted beyond words. "You did this," she hissed quietly. "You betrayed your own family." Interesting. Even now, she still meant herself when she said family. Not me. Never me. Ethan stood slowly. "No," he said quietly. "I finally stopped betraying my mother." That sentence seemed to hit Vanessa harder than the court ruling itself. Because weak men become threatening once they stop surrendering. Vanessa stared at him with open hatred now. Real hatred. The mask was completely gone. "Enjoy rebuilding your pathetic little life alone," she snapped. Then she walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Linda and Gary followed behind her, quickly avoiding eye contact with everyone. And just like that, the Mitchell family disappeared the same way they entered our lives, beautifully dressed and emotionally bankrupt. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited near the steps after hearing partial details about the probate dispute. Richard shielded me from most questions, but one young female reporter asked something that stayed with me. "Mrs. Woods, what would you say to older people afraid of losing control over their lives?" I paused. Snowflakes drifted softly through the freezing air around us. Then quietly, honestly, I answered, "Being loved should never require becoming powerless." The next few months were messy. Healing usually is. Vanessa filed for divorce almost immediately after the ruling. According to Ethan, she blamed him entirely for everything collapsing. Part of me wanted to hate her forever. Another part simply felt tired. Hatred requires energy. And after surviving emotional warfare at nearly 70 years old, I wanted peace more than revenge. Ethan moved into a small apartment across town and began attending therapy twice a week voluntarily. That surprised me. But maybe pain finally forced him into honesty. For the first time in his life, nobody was rescuing him. Not me, not Vanessa, not avoidance, just consequences. Some evenings he visited quietly to help with household repairs or yard work. Our conversations remained awkward at first, polite, cautious, full of grief neither of us knew how to navigate. Trust does not regrow overnight, especially after betrayal. One afternoon in early spring, Ethan repaired the loose fence gate Daniel always meant to fix before he got sick. I watched him from the porch while birds chirped softly in the warming air. "You know," I said carefully, "your father would have liked seeing you do that." Ethan stopped working immediately. His eyes filled. "I disappointed him. You disappointed yourself too." That hurt him more, because it was true. He sat beside me quietly afterward while we watched the sunset. Then softly, almost like a child again, he asked, "Do you think you'll ever forgive me completely?" The question lingered between us. I thought carefully before answering. I already forgave parts of you. He looked surprised. But forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing, I continued gently. And some wounds leave scars even after they heal. He nodded slowly. I understand. And for once, I think he truly did. Lily began spending weekends with me regularly after the custody arrangements stabilized. That little girl brought laughter back into my house, one crayon drawing at a time. One Saturday afternoon, she sat at my kitchen table, making a card while I baked blueberry muffins. "What are you drawing?" I asked. "Our family." Something inside me tightened slightly. Children after divorce often draw broken things. Two houses, separate parents, divided hearts. But when Lily turned the paper around, I nearly cried. She had drawn me beside Ethan holding hands. And above us, in crooked purple letters, she wrote, "Real family stays kind." Out of the mouths of children. Sometimes healing arrives through the smallest voices. A few days later, Richard visited with final paperwork regarding Daniel's trust. The conditions had now changed permanently. Because Ethan finally told the truth voluntarily and cooperated legally, portions of the trust remained accessible for Lily's future education. But the majority stayed under my control. Richard handed me the documents carefully. "You know," he said softly, "Daniel would be proud of you." I looked toward the living room window, where evening sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors Daniel installed himself 30 years ago. "No," I whispered. Then slowly, honestly, he'd be proud I finally stopped disappearing. The first thing I did after the court battle ended was sleep. Not for a night, for almost an entire weekend. Real sleep. The kind that comes only when your body finally believes danger has passed. When I woke Sunday morning, sunlight poured across my bedroom walls, and for the first time in over a year, my chest didn't feel tight with dread. No panic, no fear of phone calls, no anxiety about who might be trying to take something from me next. Just quiet. I stood slowly and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked older than before all this happened. But strangely, I also looked stronger. Trauma changes people, but surviving it changes them too. A month later, I made a decision that shocked nearly everyone around me, including Ethan. I sold a small, undeveloped parcel of land Daniel had quietly invested in years earlier and used part of the money to establish something called the Woods Foundation for Elder Advocacy. Nothing enormous, nothing flashy, just a local organization designed to help older adults facing financial exploitation, emotional coercion, and guardianship abuse. People like me, women especially. Women taught their entire lives that sacrifice equals love. Richard helped me with the legal setup. Dr. Melissa Grant volunteered medical consultation resources. And surprisingly, Ethan asked if he could help too. At first, I said no, not cruelly, honestly, because healing requires boundaries. And boundaries were still new for me. But Ethan kept showing up anyway, quietly, consistently. No grand speeches, no dramatic apologies anymore, just actions. He drove me to meetings when snowstorms made roads dangerous, helped install security cameras around the office building we rented, handled tedious paperwork nobody wanted to touch, and slowly, very slowly, I began seeing something different in him. Not weakness exactly, humility. Pain had finally forced him to grow where comfort never did. One evening after a community seminar about elder fraud prevention, Ethan helped stack folding chairs while attendees filtered out of the building. Most were older women, widows, retirees, grandmothers. Many stayed afterward just to talk. One woman in her 70s quietly admitted her nephew controlled her finances now and monitored her spending. Another confessed her children constantly pressured her to sell her home. And one tiny white-haired woman broke down crying while describing how her family treated her like a burden since her husband died. I held her hand while she cried, and suddenly, horrifyingly, I realized how common my story actually was. Loneliness makes older people vulnerable, especially loving older people. especially mothers. Driving home that night, I stared silently through the passenger window while snow drifted beneath streetlights. Finally, I whispered, "I thought I was alone." Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You're not?" "No, I wasn't." And maybe that realization became the beginning of my real healing. Not the court victory, not the money, not Vanessa losing, but understanding my pain had purpose beyond survival. Spring arrived slowly in Ohio that year. The maple tree in Daniel's backyard bloomed again. Lily turned 7, and little by little life stopped feeling like something I merely endured. I started doing things for myself again. Not for Ethan, not for family expectations. For me. I joined a lakeside walking group for women over 60. I took a watercolor painting class, despite being terrible at it. I traveled to Maine alone for 4 days simply because Daniel and I once dreamed of seeing the coast together. The old version of me would have called those things selfish. The healed version finally understood they were necessary. One afternoon during summer, Lily and I sat on the back porch, painting flower pots while cicadas hummed loudly in the trees. "Grandma?" she asked suddenly. "Yes, sweetheart. Are you sad anymore?" Children ask impossible questions so simply. I thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes." She nodded thoughtfully while painting purple stripes on a clay pot. "Daddy says people can be sad and strong at the same time." I smiled faintly. "Your daddy's learning some important things lately." That was true. Ethan continued therapy regularly. He downsized his lifestyle dramatically, sold expensive possessions, and slowly rebuilt relationships destroyed by years of avoidance. His divorce from Vanessa finalized quietly that summer. Oddly enough, I never celebrated it, because broken families are not victories. They're wounds. Necessary sometimes, but still wounds. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Vanessa moved to Chicago afterward and took a corporate marketing job. Linda and Gary reportedly distanced themselves from her once legal trouble, and public embarrassment began affecting their social reputation. That didn't surprise me. People who build relationships around status rarely stay loyal when status disappears. As for me, I stopped checking. That may have been my greatest act of healing. Not revenge. Indifference. Late one August evening, I drove alone to Hoover Reservoir, carrying Daniel's final letter in my purse. The sunset stretched gold across the water, while soft wind moved through tall grass along the shoreline. This place used to be ours. Daniel and I spent countless evenings here, talking about retirement, grandchildren dreams we never fully reached. I sat quietly on a weathered bench and unfolded the letter again. The paper had softened at the folds from rereading, especially one line: "For once in your life, choose yourself before everyone else." I used to think choosing yourself meant abandoning people. Now I understood something different. Sometimes choosing yourself is the only way to stop others from destroying you. Tears slipped down my cheeks quietly while evening light shimmered across the lake. I finally understand, I whispered aloud. And somehow, for the first time since Daniel died, I truly felt him near me again. Not in grief, in peace. When I returned home that night, I found Lily's latest drawing taped to my front door. 3 figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Me, her, Ethan. And underneath, written in crooked marker, "Families can heal if people tell the truth." I stood there crying softly in the warm summer dark. Because after everything, all the betrayal, all the humiliation, all the pain, maybe healing wasn't about returning to who we used to be. Maybe it was about becoming honest enough to love each other properly at last. And for the first time in many years, I no longer felt last. Some of the deepest wounds in life don't come from strangers. They come from the people we would have sacrificed everything for without hesitation. And sometimes the hardest lesson a loving person must learn is this: love should never require losing yourself. For so many years, Phyllis believed that being a good mother meant enduring anything silently. She believed forgiveness meant accepting disrespect, and sacrifice meant proving love. But real love, healthy love, cannot survive where dignity is constantly destroyed. Family is not supposed to make you feel small, unwanted, or afraid to speak. And growing older should never mean surrendering your voice, your independence, or your worth. This story is also a reminder that weakness can be just as harmful as cruelty. Ethan was not evil, but his silence allowed harm to grow. Sometimes people don't destroy others with hatred. Sometimes they do it by refusing to stand up when it matters most. That is why courage inside a family is so important. One honest voice can stop generations of pain. But perhaps the most beautiful lesson of all is this: it is never too late to choose yourself. Not selfishly, not bitterly, but truthfully. Healing begins the moment you stop apologizing for your boundaries. The moment you realize your kindness should not become permission for others to use you. And the moment you understand that your value does not disappear simply because you are aging, grieving, or alone. Phyllis did not heal because life became perfect. She healed because she finally understood she deserved peace too. And maybe someone watching this needed to hear that today. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Ethan deserved forgiveness? What would you have done in Phyllis's place? And if you've ever experienced betrayal, loneliness, or emotional pain within your own family, know that you are not alone. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your story below. Sometimes the strongest healing begins when we finally speak honestly about what we've survived.